I love sourdough bread, but I do not have time to make it. It takes too much time.
It is too complicated, and I hate getting sticky dough on my hands.
Do you feel the same? Well, you are not alone. But if you still wish to enjoy a simple, healthy and delicious homemade sourdough bread, you have arrived to the right place. The recipe that you'll see in this video is super simple, with minimal dough handling steps that anybody can make.
But wait, if sourdough can be so simple, why all your previous videos present recipes with so many steps?
There is a give and take to simplify sourdough bread making process. I made the same dough using my complete complex process, and you will be able to compare the results later in this video. Now, let's see the recipe. Scaling the ingredients takes about 5 minutes of your time. This is what you need to put inside. 400 grams of kamut flour or any favorite flour, 600 grams of strong bread flour, 600 grams of water, 300 grams of sourdough starter, and 20 grams of salt. Now let's analyze the recipe. There are two types of flour totalizing 1 kilogram. This represents 100% in baker's percentages. All the other ingredients are calculated in percentages in report to the total amount of flour. So 600 grams or milliliter of water are 60%, 300 grams of starter are 30%, and salt is 2%. But the sourdough starter at 100% hydration is half flour and half water. So let's add 150 grams to the original flour and water quantities, and we arrive to 1150 grams of flour and 750 grams of water. This means that the dough of this recipe is at 65.2% hydration. At this hydration, the dough is stiff and easy to manage by any beginner. I made this dough with kamut flour, but it can also be replaced by rice, spelt, whole wheat, or even the same strong bread flour. I'll give you later in this video a tip on how to adapt if your combination of flours makes a too stiff dough. As for the strong bread flour, pick a wheat flour with the highest protein percentage you can get. Ideally, 13 to 14% will be the best. The proportion of the starter is here at 30%, a bit more than the 20% that most of the recipes recommend. This will allow the dough to grow faster and have a stronger sourdough flavor. The salt is usually 2%, and my recipe follows this rule. Let's be very clear. If you do not want to get your hands dirty, you'll need a mixer to combine and knead these ingredients. Without a mixer, you'd better try a no-knead recipe to avoid the effort of kneading by hand. Unlike most of my recipes, there is no autolyse phase here. We'll do what it is called fermentolyse, meaning mixing flours, water and starter at the same time. The only ingredient that remains on the table is salt. Pour the water first, then drop the flour and starter. Adding the water first avoids forming a thin pellicule of flour on the mixer bowl's walls. The only ingredient that will make your bread rise is the sourdough starter. At the time you start this recipe, the starter needs to be at least double in size. If your starter is not that healthy to reach at least its double volume, it won't be able to rise your bread 2 times either. Let me tell you how I prepared this starter. In the morning, I took 30 grams of mother starter, add 135 grams of water and 135 grams of flour and mix all together. That is a 1 to 4.5 to 4.5 ratio. I kept the jar in a warm place, somewhere around 25 degrees Celsius, so that it's ready in the evening when I need it. So, if you go to work, prepare the starter before you leave and it will be ready by 7 p.m. If your starter is more or less active than mine during this day, you might want to play with the place where you put the jar, meaning a lower or higher temperature, so that by 7 p.m. it is at least double in size and did not start to fall back yet. Every house has warmer spots, like above the fridge or close to an electric device. For example, I keep mine above the Wi-Fi router. All these ingredients need to be at room temperature. I made this recipe during the winter and my room temperature was 20 degrees Celsius. After you've added the ingredients, turn on the mixer for 15 minutes at its lowest speed.
Why 15 minutes? You usually do 10.
Well, we didn't do an autolyse and the structure of the dough needs to be created with extra mixing time. Here is a trick. If you notice that your mixer struggles to mix a very stiff dough, add something like 50 grams more water. Flours can have different absorption properties and they can drink more or less water.
Wouldn't this change the total hydration?
Yes, but it will make the dough compact and manageable by the mixer. It is therefore more important to adapt the hydration to the flour characteristics rather than be super strict with the original quantities. You know you have the right consistency when you get a compact dough that does not stick to your hands to a quick touch. Now let the dough for 2 hours at room temperature, covering the bowl with a lid. After 2 hours at 20 degrees Celsius, you won't see much rise, but the structure of the dough has changed. It is smooth and it can be stretched without easily breaking. Now let's add the salt.
Wait. You promised a simple and low effort sourdough bread. Why didn't you put the salt from the start? It would have been much easier.
Good question. This recipe has no stretch and fold, no coil fold steps, but the internal dough structure needs to be formed so that the gas created during fermentation is trapped inside. A low hydration dough comes also with the advantage of a natural denser structure, but this is not enough. When the salt is added after the gluten formation, it will strengthen it. With an extra kneading step of just 5 minutes, the structure will be improved and the dough will be capable to hold better the bubbles inside. I've tried to eliminate this step, but the results were not satisfactory, so I strongly advise to invest 5 minutes and knead the dough a second time. Then, let the dough rest for another hour. Shaping is the last task of the day. But before going to bed, we need to put the dough in pans. I use glass pans to better show you the dough, although I rarely use them for baking bread. I find that non-stick pans or cast iron pans are better for this purpose. To avoid bread getting stuck inside the pans during baking, I need to season them with oil and dust of flour. For good non-stick pans, you might skip this step. Because I use glass pans, I'm limited to bake at a maximum of 220 degrees Celsius. The pans will support the dough during the fermentation, replacing bannetons, and will avoid manipulating a fragile dough after the fermentation. After 3 hours at room temperature, the dough did not rise much. We take the dough out of the bowl and we put it on the board. Sprinkle just a thin layer of flour on the board to avoid sticking. I promise you, this is the only time you need to touch the dough with your hands. The dough is not sticky and no extra flour is needed. Divide the dough into two as we will make 2 loaves from this quantity of dough. Try to form a rectangle by stretching the dough. Avoid the temptation of using a rolling pin to preserve the little bubbles inside. Fold the rectangle in 3, then roll the dough. To lengthen the dough to the size of the pan, you may want to gently press it and fold the dough again in 2. Place the dough into the pan with a sealing on the bottom. Let's repeat for the second piece of dough. To ensure full coverage of the pan, you can gently level the dough into the pans. I mark the level outside the pan just to compare the rise in the morning. Cover the pans with a shower cap or a bag and put the pans in a place a bit warmer, something like 25 degrees Celsius. And now it's time to go to bed. Good morning. Wow, look at them! While we were sleeping, the sourdough was very happy. It ate sugar from the flour and produced CO2, meaning our precious bubbles that are inflating the loaves. I rushed to turn on the oven to preheat to 220 degrees Celsius. Let's remove the shower caps to better see these beauties. Depending on the temperature on which they were left during the night, the loaves may be higher or lower in volume.
What if I do not have the same temperature in my room?
If the temperature is higher, the dough will ferment faster, and this means that you will need to wake up earlier to bake the bread. If the temperature is lower, the fermentation is slower, and it will double its volume later in the morning. As a general rule, once they double their volume, they are good to bake. The dough should still be bumpy and not flat. When you press the dough with the fingers, it should not fall. My dough has actually risen a bit more than double, meaning that it reached its peak but did not yet start to fall. Into the oven with them. Pour 200 milliliters of hot water over the lava rocks to create steam and immediately close the oven door. Now let them bake at 220 degrees Celsius for 40 minutes. Very interesting to observe that because the dough was more than double, the sourdough bacteria fed on the bread structure itself, weakening it, and while baking, you'll notice a downfall instead of rising. What actually happens is that with the increase of the temperature during baking, the sourdough yeast and bacteria will try to produce more CO2 before dying. This is in fact the oven spring. But if the dough structure is weak, the gas will find its channel to escape. Catching the dough at this stage is not necessarily a mistake. The higher degree of fermentation, the healthier the bread is, because it is the sourdough to process the sugars instead of you. Also, the bubbles from this advanced fermented dough are bigger than one caught at an earlier fermentation stage. Loaves need to cool before you eat them, because during the cooling time, the crumb continues its baking process. I suggest you remove the dough from the pans no earlier than you can touch the pans with your own hand. Sometimes it can get stuck, and using a spatula can be handy. Look at this beautiful steam escaping the loaves. Are you ready to cut it? There are mini bubbles in the crumb, well distributed. For the low time and effort invested in this bread, I'd call it a good loaf. If you are an advanced baker, such a loaf might not reach your expectations. But for a beginner or a busy person, let's ask.
Actually, this doesn't take too much time. If I go to the office the first day and I telework the next day, I can eat fresh bread for lunch. It doesn't sound that complex. I can give it a try, even if I am not that experienced in baking bread. But the most important is that I can make my own sourdough bread instead of buying that industrial bread that I can find in the supermarket.
The texture of the crumb is fluffy and soft, and it has a mild sour flavor. Wait, it is not over yet. I baked this bread 2 more times to show you the difference. First, this is the same recipe but baked earlier in the fermentation stage. It looks bumpier, but it's denser. Then, I bake this bread using the exact same ingredients, but following my classic process. This looks nicer, but requires more time and effort. The crumb is chewy and has fantastic aromas and flavors. I'll show you the process of this one in a future video. Let's see them side by side. Although personally I prefer this latter one, when time is at stake, the method presented in this video is perfectly fine for me to put bread on the table and share with my family. What do you think? Is it worth a try? I'll be very happy to read your opinion in the comments below.